It might be tempting to go scooting off to Versailles or Fountainbleau, or even to the Loire Valley to see royal and aristocratic chateaus, but it really isn't necessary. An architectural gem called Vaux le Vicompte is a mere 35 miles from the city. Unfortunately, it isn't particularly easy to access on public transportation, and I don't drive in Europe, so I signed up for a tour which mostly boasted about and featured Fountainbleau. I found Vaux le Vicompte to be far more interesting of the two. Its builder was named Nicolas Fouquet, a fabulously wealthy servant of the Sun King Louis XIV of France. His rise and fall bears some similarities to the story of Thomas Cromwell and his king, Henry VIII of England. Let's take a look at his life, his operations, his chateau, his ultimate fall to a king who, among other things, he likely cheated and worse, made the mistake of outshining. Today, here on the Armchair Traveler. Welcome to my channel. If you think this content is interesting or useful, please like, share, and subscribe. This will help the channel grow. Travel content often involves a lot of history, and history can be really word-heavy. Heavy enough that the details often don't make it into a video blog. If you care to dig deeper, you can visit my regular blog on WordPress, where you'll find deep dives, travel tips, reviews, warnings, and the nuts and bolts on how to travel safely and conveniently. If you'd like to keep up with my posts, you can follow me on Twitter. The addresses are on your screen and in the description box below. To understand this story, I need to introduce you to a cast of characters. We'll begin with the Sun King, his Minister of Finance, and a backstabbing bureaucrat. We'll start with Louis XIV, who was also known as Louis the Gift of God, Louis the Great, and Louis the Sun King. He was King of France from May 14, 1643 until his death in 1715. His reign of 72 years and 110 days is considered the longest of any sovereign for which there is a verifiable date. Louis's reign was important in French history not just because it lasted so long, but he was a strong-willed ruler who was determined to make his subjects obey him and make his kingdom the predominant power in Europe. To say that he was used to getting his way would be understating it. Louis was only 5 years old when his father died and he became king. We see a lot about him on television, emphasizing his lavish lifestyle, his sexual abandon, his great spending, but history also tells us that he did pay attention to the realm, at least to the extent of what happened in France and how it affected him. He was blessed, or possibly plagued, by a huge coterie of hangers-on and grifters, all shuffling madly for power and scheming, as well as his own dynastic and territorial ambitions that led him into a series of bankrupting wars. Although he was an absolute monarch, he had pretensions to be more. You'll notice in all the paintings of him, he is gorgeously apparelled. Louis was something of a dandy. He considered that his personal presentation reflected his power. He also surrounded himself with the most beautiful surroundings, the best painters, artists, musicians, clothes, food, palaces, and mistresses. Anyone who attempted to outshine the Sun King was doomed to disaster. Louis XIV's realm, his building plans, his wars, his ambitions, his clothes, and his lifestyle required huge amounts of cash. In the 17th century, as in the time of the Romans, and even today, tax collectors and money men are among the most crucial and hated in any administration. Enter Nicolas Fouquet, tax collector, fixer, loyal sycophant, and enabler of the king, minister of finance, notable party thrower, and probable embezzler. Fouquet lived and operated and eventually was destroyed in a very complicated political era. I'm two minds of Nicolas, as I'll call him from now on. Nicolas came from a wealthy aristocratic French family, but he wasn't a member of the real nobility. The family were cloth merchants from Angers in the Loire Valley and later shipbuilders. The family name Fouquet means a kind of red squirrel in the local dialect. The coat of arms you see here featured a red squirrel with the motto, "What heights will he not scale?" The answer for Nicholas was the sky was the limit until he hit an unexpected ceiling and threatened someone else's rice bowl. One way or another, in the end, he was ruined not for embezzlement, although he probably did do it, but for making the king look foolish. At this point in the story, we encounter a scheming bureaucrat, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Colbert had been Fouquet's deputy. The short version of the story is he wanted the top spot, And he also wanted to become the chief minister for the king, in part as an opportunity for graft, but in part to protect himself from charges of corruption under the now dead Cardinal Mazarin. Colbert had plenty of skill and intelligence to match his ambition, but unfortunately Fouquet stood in the way. Colbert was one step ahead of Fouquet, at least in terms of strategy and tactics. While Nicolas was away from court for long periods of time, superintending the building of his personal castle, Colbert hung around the court. His plan was to suggest to the king that Fouquet's building of this palace was beyond any imaginable honestly acquired wealth, which meant he was stiffing the king on tax collections. When Louis went to Fouquet's housewarming celebration and saw the beauty, the size of what we'll call Fouquet's Folly from now on, a combination of jealousy, he was asking himself why he didn't have that much money, greed, he wanted it for himself, rage, Fouquet must be stealing my money, added up to what we moderns might call narcissistic injury. Louis sanctioned Fouquet's arrest for embezzlement, rebuilt the entire bureaucratic structure, and installed Colbert as Comptroller General of Finances. We've met the principals in our drama. Now let's move on and meet the foot soldiers, the three men most responsible for the building of the chateau: the builder, the decorator, and the landscaper. Louis le Vaux was an architect who had worked for Louis XIV, but who also took on private commissions. Among other things, he designed and built the King and Queen's pavilions at the Chateau of Vincennes. I put up a separate walking tour of the chateau, and although I couldn't enter those pavilions, they're working government buildings to this day. You can take a look at the rest of the grounds. I'll post a link in the description, or you can just search my channel for Vincennes. Here we meet André Le Nôtre, who was already the royal architect, but like his compatriot Le Vaux, took on private commissions. Landscaping Nicolas's plot, about 100 acres, but much longer than it was wide, was a huge undertaking. None of Nicolas's grand plan or Le Vaux's architectural genius would work without the extensive landscaping. That's a lot more than just clearing the land and putting in trees and flowers. The ground was extensively terraformed, reworking the underlying terrain to suit and enhance the endeavor. Le Nôtre not only rebuilt the underlying terrain, but he developed a number of innovations designed to make the estate seem even grander than it actually was. Among other things, he built a platform surrounded by an artificial moat designed to make the chateau resemble a castle. Perhaps his greatest contribution here was the formal development of what we think of as French landscape architecture. In his model, everything is laid out geometrically, imposing symmetry and design on nature. English landscape architecture, on the other hand, is every bit as carefully designed, but is meant to emphasize the natural lay of the land. Nicolas had purchased, presumably with his own and his wife's honest money, an estate about 35 miles from down Paris. As his status and position in administration grew, he decided it wasn't grand enough to reflect his powerful personal position. He believed he needed something nicer to show that to the world. So he bought 3 neighboring villages which surrounded the estate, displacing the villagers. By the time of his big open house for the king, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, and which led to his downfall, he had 18,000 people on the estate. It was big, at least 100 acres, and heavily terraced and landscaped, so he would have needed a lot of labor just to reconfigure the ground, dig the canals, install the pools, and maintain everything. The real question is, how did he pay for it? On the left, you can see the first gate that visitors, including the undoubtedly royally annoyed Sun King, would have encountered upon arriving at Vaux le Vicompte. On the right is one of the entryways to Versailles. Louis wanted the same things for himself as he had seen at Fouquet's chateau, except, of course, Louis wanted all of his features to be gilt. These are those 2 pavilions that Le Vaux designed at the Chateau of Vincennes. More and greater work was to come, and he would survive a fiasco that was coming at Vaux le Vicompte. Le Vaux's design here was an example of a salon à l'italienne, which was a vaulted 2-story room underneath a dome. His second innovation was to build a far larger establishment on the same apparent footprint, at least as seen from the front or back exposures, by building each floor 2 rooms wide with a corridor down the middle. Vaux le Vicompte had 100 rooms. This schematic shows what isn't necessarily obvious from the front facade. Lavaux's innovation was to introduce a formal, two-storied grand space, showed in the first floor plan here. The chateau also was double depth, with a corridor running down the center. Rather than crossing from room to room by going through the rooms, you could move along the corridor, providing increased privacy for whoever was in those rooms. This particular view shows the decorative moat and the platform upon which they constructed the castle itself. It served no military purpose even when it was built, much less now, but it certainly is pretty to look at. This view of the gardens and the pools was taken from the second story of the Grand Salon. Notice the symmetrical layout of the grounds. In the far distance, beyond all the pools, is a set of steps that leads up and down from an artificial grotto, and beyond that is a huge statue of Hercules. This is a copy of a Roman statue of Hercules, which in turn was a copy of a Greek statue, which in turn was a copy of an even older Greek statue. Lenotre placed a full-size gilded version of the statue against the skyline at the far end of the main vista of Vaux le Vicompte. Wealthy collectors like Nicolas were able to collect any one of numerous bronze statues created or recreated in any size they wanted. Lenotre's landscape design used an optical illusion called foreshortening to make the long axis seem even further away than it actually was. And trust me, my feet can confirm that it was already a far distance from the back end of the chateau as it was. If you subscribe to the view that Nicolas was not just a crook, but also an egomaniac, perhaps Hercules was meant to represent Nicolas himself, lording it over his domain from the heights. Charles Le Brun was a designer, a decorator, and court painter for Louis XIV, who admired him and his work greatly. Louis thought that Le Brun was the greatest French artist of all time. Imagine Louis's chagrin, probably by this time already bordering on rage, when he discovered that his favorite pet painter had taken a private commission for a commoner, no less, and had produced decorative art so beautiful that even Louis had to gasp. Family connections counted even in the French court. You might have heard of Elizabeth Vigny Lebrun, who was married to Charles's great-nephew. She was an artist of a later generation, famous for her gauzy, flattering, romantic portraits of women in the court. This is a view of the grand two-story atrium room called a salon. Notice it has windows on each side. It was created by architect Lavaux and decorated by Charles Le Brun. At the end of the party that marked Fouquet's downfall, Louis stole pretty much everything that wasn't nailed down or otherwise attached to the walls. He even stole orange trees. However, Louis XIV didn't just steal art, he commissioned it. This large painting by Le Brun shows the Queen of Persia and her family bowing before Alexander. The painting is at Versailles. Nicolas, Lavaux, Le Brun, and Lenotre weren't oblivious to the necessity of pleasing the king one way or another, and part of that effort involved setting aside a significant part of the castle as the king's chambers. The king was apparently quite taken with his rooms. After that, he decided to take them, the entire building, all the fixtures and the decorations that could be removed, even the orange trees, and the grounds for himself. Fouquet's fall from grace, arrest, trial, conviction, imprisonment, and loss of everything, his position, his chateau, his estate, his wife, all of his money and his freedom came in 1661. On the night of August 17, 1661, Fouquet hosted a lavish soirée to honor Louis XIV at the estate. The timing was really bad. The king and his mother were in bad moods. They were in mourning over the death of Cardinal Mazarin, the steady hand that had preserved and protected the monarchy during Louis's long minority, and who had even made a significant start on regularizing the royal finances. Nicolas had spent a good deal of time away from court, finalizing the work on the chateau. He also had a scheming deputy named Colbert. Colbert wanted Fouquet's job for himself. He got the opportunity to poison the king's mind with selective facts about Nicolas's absence, including the fact that Fouquet had attempted to bribe the king's mistress, the same one that the king had brought to this party, named Louise de la Vallière. Colbert turned the bribe for information into an attempted bribe to seduce her away from the king. We have to remember that to the Sun King, appearance, the best clothes, nicest surroundings, most gorgeous paintings, most beautiful mistresses, literally the best of everything was how he not only saw himself, but he presented himself to the public. Fouquet, with this gorgeous jewel of the chateau, all of his money, the king's many wars guaranteed perpetual near bankruptcy, and even an attempt to swipe one of his women was too much to bear. I suspect the fact that the king owed Fouquet a significant chunk of change played into this as well. Despite Fouquet's rather good management of the treasury, the king still owed money to everybody and had no way to pay it back. At this point, all Louis really needed was an excuse, and this shindig was it. Louis came, he brought his mother, his brother, his mistress, and 600 other close friends. He came, he saw the gates, designed by someone that he had employed. He saw the chateau, designed by someone he had employed. He saw the gorgeous royal suite, designed and decorated by someone he employed. He saw gardens, designed by someone he employed. He thought it was all lovely. Then there was the matter of the food, served on vermeil plate, which Louis couldn't afford. There was also the matter of the play, written especially for the occasion by Molière, with music by Lully, who was the greatest French composer of his time, and the fireworks. He gazed at it all. He walked through it. He came to the party. He dined. He enjoyed the theater, the music, the enchanting fireworks, without revealing a word. Then he retired to his chambers, having all the evidence that his eyes could provide. 3 weeks later, Fouquet was arrested in Nantes by D'Artagnan, a captain's musketeers. This would be the same D'Artagnan we read of in Dumas' book, The Three Musketeers. The trial of the century dragged on for 3 years, but the judges had already decided he had to be guilty. They voted to have him banished from France. However, Louis XIV intervened with his pardon power, exercising his prerogative to overrule the judges. Instead of making the punishment lighter, he imposed a sentence of lifetime imprisonment. This is the only time in French history a monarch used his pardoning power to make the sentence worse. Fouquet was jailed, where he eventually died in 1680. I hope you enjoyed your visit here today on the Armchair Traveler. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, which will help the channel reach more interested viewers. Come back next week for another adventure here on the Armchair Traveler.